This is Cai Tanikawa Oglesby, contributing editor of this issue of Dizzy Magazine. I didn't know the extent of my grandfather's acclaim until a few years ago. Growing up, I was told that in Japan he was akin to Dr. Seuss, but I now see this comparison is only skimming the surface of a small portion of his work, far from a complete picture of his legacy. Shuntaro Tanikawa, who I call Ji, an abbreviated version of Oji-chan, the Japanese word for grandfather, began writing poetry as a teenager, first published at only 20 years old, and has since remained a pioneer of Japanese literature with followings here and abroad. For much of my life, he was nothing more than my mother's father, the quiet man I'd see every other year on trips to Tokyo, always making me a little nervous. Moving to Tokyo in 2017, I had a lot of expectations about how our relationship could potentially grow. I had started writing poetry myself a few years earlier, and having read his translated work, developed a deep respect and admiration for G. I nurtured the fantasy of a mentorship with my grandfather that never came to be. For the first few months, I was living on the first floor of his house, yet I only saw him a handful of times. I quickly learned that despite his age, he was still a very busy man, with frequent meetings and people coming and going. He only ate one meal a day around 5 p.m., and I was rarely invited. I don't believe he was trying to be exclusionary, although it may have felt that way at times. He was, and is, a solitary man, used to his own company and privacy. Perhaps I could have pushed more, but as in my childhood, I still felt shy around him, especially because of the break in our languages. Although he has worked as a translator, most well known for being the sole translator of Peanuts and Mother Goose's nursery rhymes into Japanese, these days speaking English isn't a part of his usual routine. Although I am learning Japanese, the process is slow. Despite knowing much more than I did when I first arrived, our conversations are still full of long pauses, deep concentration to remember specific words, and a lot of guessing. I'm thankful to Dizzy for giving me the opportunity to interact with G in a way I never had before. There are many things I would like to say to my grandfather, especially as he gets older. There still exist complex feelings of rejection that, although addressed, probably won't go away. Through poetry, it is easier to articulate my vulnerabilities, to tell him the things I want to without having to say them aloud. The conversation between him, my mother, Shino Tanikawa, and myself was probably the most words we'd ever spoken to each other in one sitting. We sat in the room of his house, the house where, before G, his parents lived, where my mother would visit after school as a child, where I'd spent so many summer nights when I couldn't sleep watching the shadows of the trees shoot through the shoji, the paper window screen, and the etchings of the wood ceiling, the portrait of my great-grandparents watching over us alongside model airplanes and old radios. All those nights, G was upstairs, a presence strongly felt but less often seen. As his granddaughter, parts of who I am come from parts of who he is, physically through our blood and genes, and in the views and histories that are passed down through generations within families. With this in mind, I thought it would be interesting to create a poem composed of his words. I read through an anthology of his work, titled 62 Sonnets and Definitions, and wrote down phrases out of context, collecting nearly 250. From this selection, I constructed new lines. Combining these fragments with my own words and thoughts, the result was a fully realized poem. I sent this to G, and he wrote a poem in response. I hope this written exchange is only the beginning of a much longer project, and that my grandfather and I can continue this dialogue in our poetry. In the following interview, I will be referred to as Kai, my grandfather, Shuntaro Tanikawa, will be referred to as Shun, and my mother, Shino Tanikawa, will be referred to as Shino. Kai, what does family mean to you? Shun, that's a difficult question. I've experienced 3 families, actually 4 if I include my own childhood. Which family should I refer to? Kai, just maybe the concept of the family. I'd love to hear about all of them. Shun, when I was young, I thought families always started as a pair of a man and a woman. That was my dream, for a man and a woman to be together, have children, become economically independent, and live happily ever after until death do them part. But the reality is that I've had 3 different families. Each time, with each partner, my experience and idea of family was different. The most important form of family to me was when there was Shino, my daughter, Kensaku, my son, and my then-wife, Tomoko. That family lasted for quite some time, about 25 years. It was the most important family to me. Cai. You guys were together for 25 years? Wow, I didn't know you were together for so long. Shun. So I was planning to be with Tomoko as a family until death, but somehow there were problems with other families, my father and mother's family included, and it didn't end up working out with Tomoko. Even before we had Shino and Kensaku, I had this idealization of a family. I wrote quite a few poems about them. Shino. My grandmother's dementia and my mother having to take care of her were the problems that led them to not live happily ever after. Cai. I have read a lot of your poems that have to do with family. I learned the one about your mother dying too. I've seen it come up in them. I actually took a quote from one of the poems. In other words, I am what is called a grandfather. I thought a grandfather was someone much more impressive, but now I know that is not so. It's kind of similar to the first question, but what does it mean to be a grandfather? Shun. Back in the day, grandfathers were the most important and central figure in the family, and everyone went to him for wisdom and knowledge. But that's no longer the case. Knowledge can be found on the internet, so the importance of being a grandfather has changed over the last 3 to 4 decades. Cai. Does that make you sad? Shun. Not really. Our family didn't have a close relationship with my parents, so they were never a central part of the family to begin with. Cai. What do you think it means to be a father? Shun. It was such a shocking experience. I knew I would have a child, but when I laid eyes on the actual newborn baby Kensaku, I felt this intense emotion and responsibility to protect him at all costs. I didn't ever expect to feel that way. Cai. It's funny what you said about a grandfather being someone who gives information and the family comes to for information and knowledge and wisdom, and how that's kind of eroding because of the internet. But in Japan, pretty much all of the children know who you are, so it can kind of be said in a way that you're like a grandfather to all of these children because you're some of their first exposures to poetry. What do you think and how do you feel about having such a strong following among children? I think that's something that's very unique. Shun. In my mind, family is different from the readers of my poems. Family is family and readers are readers. So the thought of children reading my poems and thinking of me as a grandfather figure makes me very uneasy. Cai. I don't know if they think that. That's something I kind of just put on them myself. But in general, do you feel any type of way of having a lot of fans that are children? Because I feel like normally the writers you think of, there's either writers that are specifically for children, like Dr. Seuss, and there's writers for adults. But you're a poet who's known by adults, but also with a lot of fans that are children. I went to dinner the other day and someone told his kid that you were my grandfather and he recited a whole poem of yours to me. Shun. How old was he? Cai. 8 or 10? Because they study you in school, you know. Shino. Wow, you have that many children fans. Shun. That's because there are quite a few poems I've written specifically for children. Also, kids know my work because they were in textbooks. Shino. There aren't many people like that. Shun. That's probably true. I'm happy to know that there are so many readers, including children. However, in Japan, there are songs for children, poems for children, novels for children, all specifically made for them. I don't think they categorize children as much in other countries. For example, we have picture books for children aged 3 to 5 years old, as well as for infants. In that sense, it seems like the mass media is being overprotective of children, and the artificial categorization has nothing to do with how the children are positioned in their home. Cai. I think that's in America too. Shino. I don't think there are poems for children in the U.S. Cai. Yeah, maybe not. Shino. But they have books. Cai. Is there a difference in the way you approach writing a picture book versus writing a poem? Shun. Very big difference. When images are involved, a story is created by combining an image with the text. In poetry, you only write the text, so you don't have to think about the image at all. In picture books, publishers usually have restrictions, like 22 scenes, so you have to think of an overall storyline and make sure each scene connects with the context. Cai. So is that harder or less enjoyable? Shun. It's enjoyable. Cai. Oh, you do? You like writing picture books more? Shun. No, I didn't say that. I like doing both the same. But when working on picture books, there is usually an illustrator or a photographer, so I enjoy the collaborative process. Sometimes the images come before I write the text, and there's a challenge. That's a challenge in itself that I enjoy. It's exciting. It's not just about stories. It can be text without a scene. Did you see the Heiwa to Senso, Peace and War, book over there? The illustrations for this book didn't come first, but the illustrator, editor, and I first came up with the concept together, and it's very simple. Cai: this is a recent work? Shun: yeah, March last year. It sold pretty well, 30,000 copies. Shino: do you have fans all over the world? Shun: I don't think there are that many. Shino: maybe not many, but you do have international fans, right? Shun: yeah, I'm sure I do. But the biggest issue is translation. I can't judge how well my Japanese poetry is translated into a language I can't understand. I understand a little bit of English, but my biggest concern is how good the translator is. There's a saying that translation of poetry is betrayal, or translation is betrayal. It's supposed to rhyme, but I forgot how it goes. But generally, I don't expect my poetry to be translated correctly. Shino: but you still think they should be translated? Shun: yeah, because it's nice to have more readers. It's great to gain readers in more countries and languages. Cai: wouldn't it be nice if the translated versions were unique works in itself? Shun: yes, exactly. I think that's the case for most of them. For the English versions, William I. Eliot and Kazuo Kawamura, who has since passed, and I would get together over beers and hum and haw about the meaning of my works. This process made it easier to trust them with my translations. Cai: but in general, do you think there are a lot of relationships like that? Shun: no, I don't think so. Shino: that's probably a special way of doing it. Cai: also, you can't really do that with old poems, but now there are some bilingual poets that write in both languages. Shun: there's Yasuhiro Yotsumoto and then Yoko Tawada, who Meg, Tanikawa's daughter-in-law, went to high school with, who has always written in both German and Japanese. She's even been nominated for the Nobel Prize, poetry and short stories. Cai: so do you mostly read Japanese poetry? Do you ever read English books? Shun: no. Cai: who are some of the poets that you're reading? Shun: do you mean Japanese or foreign? Cai: either. Who are some of your favorites and who are some of the ones that you're reading right now? Shino: you read other people's poems? Shun: of course I do, sometimes. When I was young, I was influenced the most by Jacques Prévert. He's very famous. He sold 1 million copies of poetry. He wrote Les Feuilles Mortes, Autumn Leaves. Another reason why Prévert's work was good was because he had a good translator. It was translated by my friend who's passed away. Cai: how did you know the translation was good? Shun: it's amazing that it made sense as a poem in Japanese. When poems are translated into Japanese, they often feel like it's no longer poetry. Shino: was he the only translator that translated Prévert's works? Shun: no, there were others, but his translation was the best. Also, I like Yoshida's Shakespeare translations. He's the son of a former prime minister. Cai: and right now, who are you reading? Shun: poetry? Let's see. Emily Dickinson. Her work is very hard to translate, but a friend of mine did quite a good job. Cai: so do you read a lot of non-Japanese poets? Shun: no, not many, just a few. Cai: who are some of your favorite Japanese poets? Shun: now? Contemporary? Cai: whichever. Shun: Kenji Miyazawa. Shino: Kenji Miyazawa was a poet? Shun: yes. Of course, he was also a fairy tale writer. I like his fairy tales too. I also like the works of Tatsuji Miyoshi, who is my mentor, and Mitsuharu Kaneko. Cai: how did you meet your mentor? Shun: he was my father's friend. So my father introduced my poems to Miyoshi-san. Cai: he's alive? Shun: no, he's not alive. So he read my poetry and introduced my poems to a literary magazine, and that was my first appearance to the general public. Actually, my relationship to Miyoshi-san was not that close. I would visit his house once a year and drink with him a little, but somehow I read a lot of the works he's written, so he's like a mentor to me in that sense. And I also really liked his personality, so just seeing him once in a while, I felt like he was my mentor. Cai: you started writing very young. I know you were 21 when you first got published, right? Shun: 21 or 22. Cai: how old were you when you first started writing? Shun: 17. Cai: And before that, was there anything else that you ever considered doing or thought you wanted to do? Shun. No, not at all. Cai. Never. All right. Shun. I'm into making model planes and radios and driving. I like cars. Cai. Have you ever struggled with your identity as a poet? Shun. What do I think as a poet? What do I think of being a poet? First and foremost, I had to earn a living. But in the beginning, it was really hard, so I would team up with a composer friend and write song lyrics. Radios paid for those things back then. Slowly, the media started paying for my work, and I began to be featured in magazines. Soon I was able to earn a living with manuscript fees and whatnot. Cai. Did you ever doubt yourself? Have you always been assured that you're a talented writer? Shun. I don't think I ever doubted myself, but I was very suspicious about poetry. Doubts. Poetry is words, you know? So there was a lot of doubt about words, and that was a theme for me. Cai. Doubt in what they are or what they serve to do? Shun. Words can only express a tiny fraction of reality. Cai. So what's the point of keeping doing it? Shun. At first, I didn't enjoy poetry that much, but as I continued, I grew to like it more and more. Then I started collaborating with musicians, painters, and making picture books, and I felt my poetry come alive. For me, it was more enjoyable to work on a project as a team instead of writing alone. Cai. How long did it take for you to start liking it? Shun. I probably only started enjoying it after I turned 60. Until then, there was a part of me that felt I was writing poetry to support my family. Cai. That's so funny because that's the opposite of what other artists or writers would say. Shun. Humans, including me, enjoy appraisal. When you're praised, your self-consciousness goes away. Cai. Does it make you happy to work with your son? Shun. I'm lucky my son is a musician. I think it'd be hard if he was a poet. Cai. Why? Because of the competition? Shino. They couldn't really collaborate. Cai. Well, I'm trying to be a poet, if you didn't know that. Shun. Skipping a generation might be a better idea. And you write in a different language. Cai. Yes, writing in English is totally different than Japanese. A lot of people think that poetry is inaccessible. Shun. The number of readers of modern poetry, the kind of poetry that I write, are declining. The reason is that more and more poets are writing difficult things. For example, there are poets who are trying to change the concept of the Japanese language. Do you see the Modern Poetry magazine there? On the table on the edge? Is it there? Bring it over. One example of modern Japanese poetry today, this guy is the most radical. So now my poems are selling more in China than in Japan. Cai. Really? Do you know why? Shun. China is a growing country in a cultural way, and they're interested in foreign culture now. Also, they pay well for books, I think. Cai. So, you're 88 now, and you started when you were 17. So that's been 71 years. Do you feel your voice has changed over time? Shun. Yes, very much. Modern poetry has few readers, so in order to gain more readers, I accepted writing jobs when people asked for children's poems, or poems for the elderly, and even jobs from women's tabloid magazines. Each time, I wrote with the readers in mind. I do think my range of poems expanded because of that. The other thing is, I easily get bored of writing in only one way. When I start to feel bored in one way, I start writing in a different way and start on a new book. This is something I've been doing over and over. Cai. How? Shun. I do it subconsciously. One day, the first line comes to me out of nowhere. If the line is different from the other poems I'd written, I can base my new writing style on that first line. My style doesn't change unless I have that line. Now, I don't use topics or themes when writing poetry. I want words to flow as they are. If someone asks me to work on a seasonal piece about spring, I will use spring in the first line, but the poem won't necessarily be about spring. Cai. Do you ever get writer's block? Shun. No. Even if I did, I'd forced myself to write, because I wouldn't get paid if I didn't write anything. Cai. Do you have any advice for young poets? Shun. Depends on the individual. Nothing general. That's very hard. Cai. That's a good answer, I guess. Did you have any feelings when you learned that your granddaughter, me, is interested in writing poetry? Shun. I will enjoy it tremendously. Cai. What are you working on right now? Shun. Next year, a publisher asks me to make a book of mine, so I'm adding a new poem for that publisher. I'm thinking about having at least 2 styles of poetry in one book. Cai. What 2 styles? Shun. One is a conversational poem written only in hiragana, like it's talking to someone. Cai. What is the meaning of using only hiragana? Shun. The voice inside of me speaks more in hiragana. Kanji still feels foreign to me because it was imported from China. So language-wise, I think it's a bit unusual that Japanese people use 4 types of characters: hiragana, katakana, kanji, and sometimes the Roman alphabet. That comes in handy when writing poems in Japanese. Cai. And what's the second style in the next book? Shun. A normal hiragana and kanji mixture. Cai, when did you realize that you wanted to write poems? You showed me poems when you were little. Shino sent them to me when you were 7 or so. Did you start writing those on your own? Cai. I don't remember at all. Shino. I think she wrote it in school. Shun. I can look for it. I'm sure I saved it somewhere. Cai. I can't really remember, but actually one of the first poems I wrote was when we went to the cemetery. That was in January, like 4 years ago, right when Mori was born. That was the first time that I'd gone there as an adult. Shun. Do you mean Tokeiji Temple? Shino. Yeah, we went there during the first New Year's after Mori was born. Cai was moved by how beautiful Tokeiji was, and it inspired her to write. Before that, I think she had only written poems in school. I think it was Poetry Month in April, so each year they made students write poems. I think that's the one she wrote as a child. Cai. It will come if it's meant to be, or you just forced yourself to write like G did. An expanding extension of something I've always known. Learning you through your words, I escape the sounds of overflowing youth to snatch a familiar silence from your younger song. Teach me to string mine together, as a grandmother supposedly teaches to sew. A giant, but so small. Maybe by 88, creeks don't scare you anymore. There is humility in shadows, a homecoming in neglect. Children are molded into humans only when curses are undone.
Cai poem in Japanese translation. 広がり続ける広がりを私はずっと知っている。言葉を通してあなたに学んで。若い頃のあなたの詩からおなじみの沈黙をひったくろうと、私は溢れ続ける若さの騒音から逃げ出す。教えて、私の詩をあなたに重ね縫いするのを、おばあちゃんが多分裁縫で教えてくれたように。巨人で小兵、ベージュになったらもうどんなきしみにも悩まされない。隠された謙虚さ、無視された気境、子供らは人間へと型抜きされる。まじないが解けた時だけ。孫娘の会に、谷川俊太郎。すぐ近くの山が遠くに見える。私から立ち去ろうとするかのように、生まれる前の思い出のように、老いて私の視野が広がったのか。母と父を借りて、自然が黙って私を産み落とした瞬間から、賑やかな人間世界のただ中に私はいる。言葉だけで永遠を知ったつもりで。目に見えるものに教えられ、耳に聞こえるものに慰められて、今一日はかけがえのない贈り物。夕焼けのリボンに飾られて。貝という名の通り、君は漕ぐ。決してまたげない水平線に向かって。歌うクジラ、漂うクラゲ、潜む海賊、沈む島。遠かった道が近づいてくる。
Shuntaro Tanikawa, for Cai, my granddaughter. A nearby mountain looks distant, as if it were leaving me. Has my field of vision widened because of old age, like my memories before I was born? Since the moment nature gave me birth, with the help of my mother and father, I have been in the midst of this riotous human world, pretending to know about eternity by means of words alone, taught by things visible, comforted by things audible, and adorned with the irreplaceable gift of the red ribbon of the setting sun just even at this very moment. You're rowing out, just as your name suggests, an oar, rowing to a horizon never to be reached. A singing whale, a floating jellyfish, a hidden pirate, a sinking island, and the distant unknown are coming ever closer. Translated by William I. Elliott and Katsumasa Nishihara.